Here's the truth no one tells you. The reason you want it so intensely is because a version of you already has it. Your desire isn't reaching forward, it's reaching back. Let that settle for a moment. Let the mind soften and feel the way something inside of you subtly leans forward, because somewhere within you, beneath the noise and beneath the years of conditioning, something has always known this. Something ancient, something quiet, something that breathes beneath the surface of your awareness. You want what you want, not because it's missing, but because a future version of you is already living it, embodying it so fully that the echo travels across timelines until it reaches you here. When you feel that ache, that longing, that unmistakable pull towards something that hasn't yet materialized, it isn't emptiness, it isn't lack, it isn't absence, it is recognition, it is the memory of a life your soul has already touched, a memory disguised as desire. And this is where the paradox begins. You've been taught your whole life that wanting means lacking, that desire is evidence of distance, that the more intensely you crave something, the further away it must be. But what if the opposite is true? What if the intensity of your desire is actually the vibrational pressure of a future self trying to break through the surface of your current timeline? What if nothing is missing at all? What if you're simply remembering? Pause and let that breathe inside you. Your desire is not a signal of not enough. It is not your mind fantasizing. It is not a flaw or a weakness. Desire is resonance. It is the frequency match between who you are in this moment and who you are becoming in another reality. And the reason your desire feels so personal, so specific, so precise is because it is. The future you already exists right now, vibrating at a frequency your body can feel before your mind can fully interpret it. Imagine, for a moment, that there is a version of you living the exact reality you ache for. The relationship, the health, the purpose, the wealth, the peace. Not a fantasy, you, the you that you secretly know you could be if something inside finally unlocked. That version is not symbolic. They are real, they are present. They are close enough that if you close your eyes, you can sense them at the edge of your awareness, like a silhouette made of light waiting just behind the veil of your current identity. That feeling of closeness, that strange sense of familiarity with a life you haven't lived, is not imagination. It is entanglement, the phenomenon in quantum physics where two systems share information instantly across time and space. You and your future self are not separate. You are two expressions of one field, two notes of the same song, two timelines sharing memory. This is why desire feels so alive, because it isn't a wish, it's a message from a version of you who has already collapsed the reality you're reaching for. And when the message arrives in your body, it arrives as longing, as a pull, as a sense of I'm meant for more. That sensation is not fantasy, it's direction, it's guidance. It's the gravitational pull of a timeline that belongs to you. You've spent years interpreting desire as distance, when in truth, it is closeness. It hurts not because the thing is far, but because it is near, so near that you can sense the outline of it while still believing it's out of reach. That ache is the friction between timelines, the you who remembers and the you who forgets. Feel the truth in this. You don't desire what isn't meant for you. You don't ache for what isn't aligned with you. You don't crave what isn't encoded in your field. You only want the timelines you are already connected to. You only long for the versions of life that you are already entangled with. You only feel the pull toward futures that already exist in the quantum structure of your being. This is not wishful thinking. It is resonance. In physics, systems that share frequencies find each other. They sync, they lock, they converge. Your desire is the evidence of that lock. It is the proof that the future you is real. It is the signal that the wave has already collapsed. You are simply walking toward what has already happened in another version of you. As your breath slows and your awareness widens around this truth, something inside you begins to remember. You are not chasing a dream, you are receiving a memory arriving from ahead of you, but belonging to you nonetheless. And every time you feel the pull, every time you feel the longing, every time you feel that internal whisper of "there is more for me," that is your future self speaking, not metaphorically but energetically, calling you toward the timeline where everything you want is already real. So let this be your anchoring truth as we move deeper into this journey. You want it because it's already yours on another timeline. And your desire is the bridge between who you have been and who you already are. You've felt the pull, you've sensed the ache, you've tasted the strange familiarity of a life you haven't lived. And now we go deeper into the mystery behind why the future can feel so real long before it arrives. Because the idea that your desire is a memory is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a neurological, emotional, and quantum phenomenon woven into the architecture of your consciousness. And when you understand how the brain, the nervous system, and the field interact, your entire relationship with desire transforms from confusion into clarity and from longing into remembering. The first truth to anchor into is this: your brain is not designed to record reality. Your brain is designed to predict it. Neuroscience calls this predictive coding, the discovery that the brain doesn't passively observe the world, it constructs it. Every moment you're alive, your brain is forecasting the next moment, drawing on internal models built from memory, expectation, emotion, and possibility. This means your brain is not living in the present, it is living in the next version of the present. And this matters because when a future becomes emotionally charged enough, vivid enough, and resonant enough, the brain begins treating it as memory. Think about that. A future event, repeated internally, with enough intensity, becomes coded as something your body already knows. And once the body knows something, it begins shifting toward it long before the event manifests externally. This is why you sometimes feel pulled toward a path you haven't walked, why you have dreams that feel like déjà vu, why certain possibilities feel strangely inevitable. Your brain isn't imagining a fantasy, it's remembering a timeline. But this remembering is not purely cerebral. The body is involved, the nervous system is involved, the heart is involved. Biology does not wait for physical evidence. Biology responds to emotional consistency. When you rehearse a future identity through imagination, desire, or elevated emotion, your nervous system adapts. Your breath changes, your posture changes, your decision-making changes, your tolerance for misalignment decreases, and your field, the electromagnetic aura surrounding your body, begins to recalibrate. This is the point where science and mysticism begin to mirror each other, because ancient traditions have always said the future exists alongside the present, not ahead of it. They taught that your soul lives outside of linear time, that timelines coexist like multiple frequencies on a single radio, and that consciousness can tune to any of them. What modern neuroscience calls predictive coding, ancient mystics called remembering. What physics calls entanglement, mystics call destiny. So when a vision keeps returning, when the same desire repeats, when the same possibility keeps calling, it is not random. You are tuning to a future frequency. You are brushing against the edges of a timeline, where the version of you who already has what you want is trying to make contact. And the emotional intensity of that contact is what you call longing. But here's the deeper layer. The brain does not distinguish between past and future. It distinguishes only between emotionally charged and emotionally neutral. That means a memory from childhood and a vision of the future are processed through the same neural pathways when the emotional charge is strong enough. This is why trauma can come from something that isn't happening anymore, and it's why transformation can come from something that hasn't happened yet. Your body keeps the score, yes, but your body also keeps the prophecy. When you feel the pull toward a future self, your system is registering it as both possibility and remembrance. It doesn't care whether the event has occurred physically. It only cares whether the emotional signal is consistent, and the more consistently you feel the future, the more real it becomes internally. The more real it becomes internally, the more your biology shifts toward it. The more your biology shifts towards it, the more your field broadcasts it. And the more your field broadcasts it, the more your external reality reorganizes to match it. This is not metaphor, this is coherence. But here's the subtle tension. If the future self is so available, why does it still feel out of reach? Why is the remembering so faint at times? Why does the vision wobble between clarity and doubt? The answer lies in emotional interference. When desire is tangled with resistance, when longing is mixed with fear, when hope collides with memory, the signal becomes distorted. The future self is sending a clear transmission, but the present self is filtering it through past wounds. This is the friction you feel, not because the future is uncertain, but because you are hearing it through layers of conditioning. Old heartbreak, old beliefs, old fears, old identities. These act like static in the field, scrambling the signal, making the future self harder to sense. But the signal is always there. It never stops. It never weakens. It never abandons you. It waits for you to quiet the noise long enough to hear it clearly. And when you do, something incredible happens. Your breath deepens, your chest softens, your mind quiets, your field steadies. You begin to feel a presence, not external, but internal, a familiarity, a knowing, a recognition that doesn't require proof. That presence is your future self stepping forward, not figuratively, but neurologically and energetically. In a coherent state, your brain waves slow, your heart rhythm becomes ordered, and your nervous system shifts into safety. And in that safety, the remembering accelerates. This is when the future timeline begins merging with the present one. Subtle at first, then clearer, then undeniable, not because you forced it, but because you tuned to it, not because you chased it, but because you listened. This is the mechanics of remembering. And now that you understand the signals, the question becomes, how do you distinguish between desire rooted in lack and desire rooted in memory? That is where we go next. There comes a moment on every transformation path where you feel split between two worlds. One world is the life you know, the familiar emotional gravity of doubt, waiting, striving, hoping. The other is the life you sense, a future self-timeline that feels close enough to touch, yet somehow just beyond reach. The tension between these two worlds is not weakness, it is physics, because every desire contains two frequencies, the frequency of lack and the frequency of knowing. And the timeline you collapse depends entirely on which one your body broadcasts. This is the misunderstanding that traps almost everyone. They believe desire is enough. They believe wanting something intensely should magnetize it toward them. They believe visualizing harder should call it in faster. But the field doesn't respond to intensity, it responds to coherence. And coherence is not emotional loudness, it is emotional alignment. It is when your thoughts, your nervous system, and your identity are all vibrating at the same pitch. Not hoping, not grasping, not negotiating, knowing. But before we explore the frequency of knowing, we must acknowledge what most people unknowingly transmit: lack. Lack is not a mindset, it is a vibration. Somatic, biochemical, electromagnetic. It is the pattern your body learned from years of disappointment, scarcity, or unpredictability. Lack has a physical signature: the tightening in the chest, the shallow breath, the forward lean of trying, the mental loop of not yet, the emotional undertone of waiting. When desire is filtered through this somatic history, it becomes distorted. It collapses into longing rather than alignment. And longing, no matter how spiritual it appears, signals the field: I am separate from what I want. It is not here. This is the paradox that most people never see. Every time they check for progress, they reaffirm the gap. Every time they ask, where is it? They vibrationally declare, it isn't here. Every time they rehearse the desire, but still feel doubt, they collapse a timeline where it remains missing. This is not punishment, it is resonance. In quantum mechanics, a system only stabilizes into one outcome when the measurement is consistent. Emotion is that measurement. Emotion collapses the wave. Emotion signals the field. And emotion tells the universe which version of you is currently observing reality, the seeker or the one who has already arrived. But here is where things become beautifully liberating. Your desire is not the problem. Desire is the compass. Desire is the bridge. Desire is the message from your future self. What distorts the signal is the emotional charge behind it. When desire is charged with fear, doubt, urgency, or insecurity, it vibrates as lack. Lack attracts more lack. Not because the universe is cruel, but because the field mirrors what you are, not what you wish. Knowing, however, is different. Knowing is quiet, stable, grounded. It is not intensity, it is coherence. Where lack tightens, knowing expands. Where lack leans forward, knowing relaxes back. Where lack says, I need it, knowing says, it's done. Where lack checks for evidence, knowing becomes the evidence. Knowing is the vibrational signature of the future self. It is the emotional baseline of the timeline where your desire is already lived, embodied, integrated. And when your current self begins to broadcast that same frequency, the timelines begin to merge. But to feel this knowing, you must understand its biological depth. When you enter a state of elevated emotion, gratitude, clarity, awe, certainty, your heart rhythm becomes coherent. Coherence means the electrical signals of the heart become ordered rather than chaotic. When the heart shifts into coherence, the brain follows, synchronizing into patterns associated with intuition, creativity, and non-linear awareness. In this state, your electromagnetic field becomes measurably stronger, your signal becomes cleaner, and a cleaner signal collapses a cleaner timeline. This is why elevated emotion is not a spiritual technique, it is an electromagnetic event. And this is why the future self feels easier to sense when your body is calm, open, regulated, and safe. A dysregulated nervous system cannot receive a coherent future signal. It can only amplify the past. Safety is the portal. Regulation is the antenna. Coherence is the transmitter. So the question becomes, how do you shift from the frequency of lack to the frequency of knowing? The first step is awareness, not judgment. Awareness. Notice the difference in your body. Lack feels like reaching. Knowing feels like remembering. Lack feels like, I hope it comes. Knowing feels like it's already unfolding. Lack searches for signs. Knowing becomes the sign. Lack argues with the moment. Knowing collaborates with it. When you become aware of the shift, you can begin choosing the timeline you anchor into. Not with force, with familiarity. Because the timeline of knowing is not created, it is remembered. It already exists. You are not building it from scratch. You are tuning to the emotional frequency where it is already real. Every time you breathe slowly, you tune. Every time you drop into gratitude without needing evidence, you tune. Every time you embody the posture, breath, and energy of the version of you who already has it, you tune. Every time you stop checking, you tune. And each moment of tuning strengthens the entanglement. This is when reality begins to rearrange, subtly at first. You think differently, you respond differently, you make decisions from an elevated vantage point. People treat you differently, not because they changed, but because your field did. And your field is the blueprint the physical world builds from. So now we approach the deeper question at the heart of this movement. If knowing is the frequency that collapses timelines, what blocks you from embodying it consistently? That is where we go next, into the emotional gravity of the past self and the process of shifting your identity into the future version of you who already has what you desire. At some point on the journey, longing is no longer the central feeling, recognition is. The future self you've been sensing begins to shift from abstraction into presence, and you start to feel the subtle but undeniable truth. You are not trying to become someone new, you are remembering someone familiar, someone whose footsteps you can faintly hear, someone whose breath you can feel in your own chest, someone who has been waiting patiently on another timeline for you to catch up, slow down, and finally listen. This is the phase where the work stops being conceptual and becomes intimate. Because the real transformation doesn't happen when you understand the future self. It happens when you identify with them. When you stop looking at them as a distant possibility and start treating them as the most honest version of you. When you stop chasing and start choosing. When you shift from, I hope I become that person, to, oh, that's me. This is the identity pivot that collapses timelines. But before that pivot becomes stable, you must understand the force that pulls you away from it, the emotional gravity of your past self. Every version of you creates its own center of gravity, patterns, habits, emotional baselines, survival strategies, ideas of who you're allowed to be. These patterns don't disappear simply because you had a spiritual insight. They have biological weight, neurological grooves, and familiar emotional chemistry. And chemistry creates comfort, even if the comfort is painful. Your past self has spent years building a home inside your nervous system. And even when you've outgrown that home, the body instinctively returns to what it knows. Fear feels familiar. Doubt feels predictable, struggle feels logical, so when the future self begins calling you forward, gently, steadily, almost lovingly, your past self resists. Not because it doesn't want you to grow, but because growth requires unfamiliar emotions. And to the nervous system, unfamiliar often equals unsafe. This is why stepping into a timeline where you already have what you desire feels exhilarating one moment and terrifying the next. Not because the future is uncertain, but because your body is detoxing from the chemical identity of who you used to be. Your past self whispers in habits, in reflexes, in protective beliefs. Can you really hold this? What if you fail? What if this isn't you? What if it's safer to stay where you've always been? These whispers are not sabotage. They are the echoes of a self that survived by staying small, cautious, or invisible. A self that protected you. A self that got you this far, but a self that is not equipped to lead you into the timeline you're now remembering. The future self is. So here is the shift. The moment you begin identifying with the future self more than with the past one, your entire biology reorganizes. Your breath deepens, your posture opens, your decisions sharpen, Your emotional range expands. You begin behaving without force as someone who already has what you desire. You notice yourself speaking differently, walking differently, thinking differently, not because you're pretending, because you're remembering. And remembering is the key. When you remember a future version of yourself, your nervous system stops broadcasting lack. It stops leaking doubt. It stops collapsing the timeline where you're perpetually waiting. Instead, it begins to broadcast inevitability. It begins to anchor certainty. It begins to resonate with the emotional signature of the timeline where your desire is already integrated into your identity. This is not visualization. This is neurological installation. When you feel the emotions of the future self, calm, knowing, abundance, ease, your brain wires those emotions as truth. And once wired, they become your baseline, not a peak you visit, but a home you live in. And from that baseline, the field responds instantly, because identity is the strongest signal you send into the quantum field. Not your affirmations, not your rituals, not your words. Identity. The field mirrors who you are, not who you hope to be, not who you try to be, not who you momentarily imagine yourself to be, who you are. So when your identity shifts, even slightly, the reality that matches that identity begins reshaping itself around you. But how do you consistently embody the future self when the past self keeps pulling you back? The answer is tenderness. The future self doesn't dominate the past self. It comforts it, it reassures it, it expands it. Imagine placing a hand on the shoulder of your younger self and saying, "You're safe now, I've got this." That same energy is required internally. You don't fight the past identity, you gently retire it, you thank it, you let it rest, because its job is complete. And as the emotional gravity of the past releases, you begin to feel something extraordinary, the gravitational pull of the future. At first, it feels like a whisper, then a tug, then a presence, then a state of being that becomes so natural, so embodied, so familiar that you realize, this is who I have always been. The timeline merges not through force, but through remembering. The future becomes the present, not because you chase it, but because you surrender to the version of you who already holds it. And once that identity stabilizes, the external world begins to shift in ways that appear miraculous, but are in fact coherent. So what happens when you stop waiting for reality to change and begin collapsing the timeline through emotional fidelity to your future self? Let's explore this next. You will eventually realize the greatest barrier between you and your future self is not the universe, not timing, not destiny, but the loop. The loop of waiting, the loop of checking, the loop of hoping, the loop of almost. This loop is subtle. It does not scream, it whispers. It appears as patience when it is actually postponement. It masquerades as faith when it is actually doubt. It looks like preparation when it is actually resistance. But now, in this moment, that loop begins to unravel. Because the loop is not a cosmic test. You are not being asked to wait. The loop is an identity pattern generated by a past self who learned to survive through anticipation instead of embodiment. To collapse the loop, you must first understand its architecture. Waiting is not passive, it is vibrational. When you are waiting, your nervous system is broadcasting a very specific emotional signal. It's not here yet. That signal becomes your state. That state becomes your identity. That identity becomes the timeline you collapse. Every time you check for signs, you reinforce the gap. Every time you monitor your progress, you signal uncertainty. Every time you hope it's coming, you subconsciously confirm that it's not. And the field, loyal and neutral, organizes around your signal, not your wish, your signal. This is why so many people live in a perpetual state of almost healed, almost abundant, almost confident, almost free. They don't realize they are rehearsing the vibration of almost with immaculate consistency. They wake up in the frequency of waiting and fall asleep in the frequency of hoping. And hoping is just longing, dressed in softer language. Longing is just fear, wrapped in spiritual vocabulary. The universe does not respond to longing, it responds to coherence, the internal state of "it is done," long before anything in the physical world gives you permission to believe it. So how do you collapse the loop of waiting? You break its emotional code. You stop sending the signal of "not yet." You stop measuring your growth by what you can see. You stop letting the 3D timeline dictate your internal state. Instead, you activate a more powerful mechanism, fidelity. Fidelity to the version of you who has already crossed the threshold. Fidelity to the identity that already lives the reality you desire. Fidelity to the emotional truth of the future self who does not need proof because they are the proof. This fidelity is not delusion, it is coherence. It is the state where your thoughts, emotions, and nervous system all vibrate at the frequency of the timeline you want to collapse. This is why internal alignment is so potent. It collapses timelines faster than action ever could. Action without inner alignment is friction. Action with fidelity is momentum. When the body believes the future is inevitable, reality has no choice but to respond. But fidelity requires one profound shift. You must stop negotiating with your old identity. The past self will attempt to pull you back into the loop with familiar emotional hooks, fear, doubt, impatience, logic. It will argue for caution, it will demand evidence, it will insist that nothing has changed. But the moment you allow the past self to define your state, you collapse the timeline where the future self leads. And so the loop strengthens. To dissolve the loop, you must become emotionally loyal to the future self over the past one. Loyal in breath, loyal in posture, loyal in thought, loyal in decision-making, loyal in how you speak about your life internally. This is emotional fidelity, not forcing belief, but consciously choosing which version of yourself you give authority to. Imagine this shift as a change in gravitational pull. The past self has a weight to it, dense, predictable, familiar. The future self has a lightness, expansive, curious, inevitable. When you wake up in the morning and allow the past self to decide how you feel, you fall back into the old gravity. When you wake up and choose to breathe as the future self, you rise into the new orbit. This is not fantasy, this is embodiment. An embodiment collapses timelines. Something extraordinary happens when you remain faithful to the future self long enough. The loop stops trying to pull you back. The nervous system begins to recognize the future identity as the new emotional home. Doubt weakens, impatience dissolves, hope transforms into certainty. And certainty is not loud, it is quiet, grounded, cellular. You stop waiting for signs because you become the sign. You stop asking questions like, when will it happen? Because the question itself becomes irrelevant. You don't ask when something arrives when you already feel it in your bones. This is the moment when reality begins to shift around you. Synchronicities accelerate, opportunities surface. People respond differently, not because the universe suddenly decided to reward you, but because you withdrew your fidelity from the timeline of waiting and devoted it to the timeline of having. The outer world is always the last layer to rearrange. The inner world is the architect. And here is the final truth of this movement. The loop of waiting stops the moment you decide it does. Not the moment you hope. Not the moment you wish. The moment you decide. The moment you choose the future self over the familiar self. The moment you hold the emotional posture of "it is done," even while the evidence is still dissolving and rearranging in the unseen. Let's explore what happens when you no longer need your future to arrive because you have already become the one who lives it. The striving stops, not because you gave up, but because you finally caught up, because the version of you who once felt distant, the one living the timeline you ache for, is no longer ahead of you. They are here, breathing through your chest, thinking with your mind, moving through your body. This is the moment where the future self stops feeling like a possibility and starts feeling like your nature. When the frequency of having becomes more familiar than the frequency of wanting, the timeline collapses. Reality rearranges, identity stabilizes, and you realize the truth you've been circling this entire time. You were never trying to become this version of you, you were remembering them. In this state of remembrance, something profound shifts. You no longer need signs because your emotional signature has already become the sign. You no longer seek proof because your body is already carrying the frequency of the outcome. You no longer rehearse the desire because the desire has fulfilled its purpose. It pulled you into coherence. It bridged you into identity. It introduced you to the self who already lives what you once longed for. And now, longing dissolves into presence. Hope dissolves into embodiment. The future dissolves into now. This is the paradox at the heart of quantum creation. You don't attract what you want, you attract what you are. And when you become the emotional match of the timeline you desire, not through performance, but through coherence, the field begins responding with startling precision. People shift around you, opportunities surface effortlessly. Coincidences tighten into patterns. Life begins organizing itself around the frequency you now stabilize, not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. The future timeline can finally arrive because nothing in you is pushing it away anymore. This is the moment where your breath slows, where your chest opens, where your inner dialogue softens into certainty. And certainty is quiet. It does not assert, it does not grasp, it does not chase. It simply knows. This knowing is not mental, it is vibrational. A full body recognition that the version of you who has it is not out there, waiting. They are in here, awakening. Let's close out with what we have remembered today. Return for a moment to the very first truth you heard in this journey. You want it so intensely because a version of you already has it. Now feel how differently those words land. They are no longer a mystery, no longer a paradox, no longer an idea you're trying to believe. They are a memory, a recognition, a homecoming. You are no longer the seeker standing outside your future. You are the field calling it into form. You are the coherence that bends time. You are the identity that reality now reorganizes around. And the life you once longed for is no longer ahead of you. It is unfolding from within you. Because in the deepest truth of the quantum field, you want it because it's already yours on another timeline, and now you are finally living it.